Ben is preaching the book of Daniel right now, and so we're talking apocalyptic literature, the end times, the rapture, what's going to happen in the end. Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. I'm Tyler. Andrew's here. Ben's here. The band is back together.
Man, Ben, I'm so glad you're here.
Dude, so sometimes we record multiple of these that are in a row, but last week you were gone, and we did one, and we finished it, and we're like, it's just not the same. Let's get out of here.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
I'm touched.
I by an angel, I was like, really?
That's the title of my sermon this week.
Touched by an angel?
Yeah.
Stop it.
Yes.
I did not know that.
Because Daniel gets touched by an angel in this vision, and so I'm going to...
Are you going to do it in a Jane Seymour accent every time?
Yeah.
I'm an
She is
angel
that person,
sent
right?
by
No,
God.
it's Roma Downey.
Roma Downey.
Dang
Yeah.
it. That was a good joke.
She would
that I
always
ruined.
go, I'm an angel sent by God. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great intro because...
What are the chances, since we've known each other, how many touched by an angel jokes have I made?
I think
Zero. I just made my first touch by an angel joke, and that happens to be the title of your sermon this Sunday?
Isn't that funny?
Okay. That's not funny. That's something else.
That's a God thing.
That's...
As opposed to everything else that happened, that was a God thing.
All right. Christianese, that's a God thing.
We already did that episode.
We did it. That's a God thing?
Yeah.
We did that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
All right.
I made my stance very clear.
Christianese.
So as this comes out, which is tomorrow, Friday, the day after that, we have this thing called NGC University.
It's true.
By the way, if you're listening Friday, come out. It's Saturday morning. And we have these different classes we offer, helping Christians grow. And so you said that you're like, ooh, I'm going to do some of my doctoral dissertation stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so I need to apologize to you.
Uh-oh.
Because whenever I saw what you were doing, it says preaching Christ from the Old Testament. I was like, that's really cool. I wonder if we have a single person that doesn't preach in our church who would be interested in that. That's interesting. So I hope there's more than 3 people who sign up for that class.
You're the worst.
That was my thought, and I was just like, oh, I don't know. But guess what? It's the largest class we have.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
I feel validated after being completely neutered by a man I thought was my brother in arms.
Yeah, dude. It's the biggest class though.
Can you record that class? Because I've been having trouble sleeping, and be good to listen
I
to.
thought you were going to say I've been having trouble preaching the Old Testament.
That too.
It's like,
Just kidding.
These are the
That'd be a great class.
These are the moments I wish Cody had a camera on him. He just can't stop laughing over there.
So I think I should run my future titles by you, Tyler.
No, I don't think you should because I was wrong.
All right. Well, there it is.
It will be a great class.
Thanks.
Oh, I think it's
Ben.
gonna be awesome. Yeah,
I can't come, but
no, there was no question about whether it'd be great or not. I just thought that's a nuanced thing,
Yeah.
or a very niche thing,
Niche. It's a
niche thing where it's okay, it's like preaching Christ
Very
from the Old
niche.
Testament, very, and so,
Yeah.
but dude, we have some awesome people at this church who want to know,
You are super nerdy.
who are interested in that sort of thing.
All right.
All right, what do you want to talk about today?
Not that question we got or that response we got on altar calls.
You don't want to talk
Ben
about
and I
it?
read it and it's quite pointless.
Okay,
Well, anyway, I think it's a bot. I think you need to read it. It's not real.
I don't think that's a bot.
You sure? Why? Because it's your fake account?
Yeah.
So anyway, somebody was real mad about our altar call episode, and they were super convinced that altar calls are very biblical, and they put in there a bunch of references in the Bible that we read that have nothing to do with altar calls.
Okay.
And then they started speaking halfway through in King James English. So, so I was like,
Maybe it's like a chat GPT thing or whatever.
so anyway, I don't know whose burner account that is, and I probably just offended a church member that is really into altar calls, but it is what it is. So yeah, none of those scriptures say anything about altar calls, and issue over.
Archive that card.
Archive.
All right. So what do you want to talk about?
So Ben, we're going to talk about the end times because Ben is now an expert on eschatology, as he's finishing up the book of Daniel, which he is preaching right now. And this week, in his sermon titled "Touched by an Angel,"
yeah.
Are you going to sing "He Touched Me"? You know that song?
No.
Okay.
You don't know that song?
No.
Oh man,
What song is it?
how do you not know that song?
He Touched Me?
Yeah, it's like
Cody,
a
would we get in
famous-
trouble on YouTube if we would if we
Yeah.
play the song? Okay.
Dang. It's a famous old hymn, dude.
It's not ringing a bell.
Wow. Clear, true, and compelling, but whatever. All right. So eschatology. People are wondering about last things touched by an angel. So you're in Daniel like 11 this
10.
week? 10? How many chapters are there in Daniel?
12.
Ooh. So when and where and how is it all going to go down? You taught this last week on the times and half a times, time stuff.
No, but yeah, that was a couple weeks ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what have you learned in your fresh study of Daniel on as it relates to the eschatological debate? Because if we title this podcast something to do with the end times, it'll blow up, Tyler. I promise you.
So what I've tried to do is educate our people on what apocalyptic literature is in the Bible and the certain interpretive rules that come with that. To help us not get lost in the weeds and to really, because I don't think that's the point of apocalyptic literature. There's tons of symbolism and imagery and things that are supposed to be interpreted figuratively, not literally. And I think that's where a lot of people get messed up is they take these symbols because they don't realize apocalyptic's not the same as OT narrative or an epistle. It's unique. And they get real lost or confused, or it becomes real complex because they're not realizing these are symbols that represent something that's really true, but that's just what they are. They're symbols. And there's an overall theme in these apocalyptic visions that is the most important thing God is communicating, not trying to exegete and understand every detail or mathematical calculation or different things. So I've really been focusing on what's the overall theme. Why is this in the Bible? Why was this inspired by God to be written down for the exiles while they were still in exile? And why is it written down for us now living thousands of years later in the new covenant? And I don't think it's so that we can speculate and predict every single little detail of how the end times is going to play out. So, but it does teach us that God's in control, that he's working his redemptive plan, that evil rulers, whether in the past or in the future, he's going to conquer, and God's people are going to reign with him forever. So, I mean, I have views on things. Like I shared with the church last week my view on the 70 weeks.
Tell us your view.
Well, I don't know if it's good podcast fodder. I mean,
dude, what else do we have to talk about? And secondly, what else do we have to talk about?
Well, I think the 70 weeks there are symbolic, are not literal.
Sure.
And so 7 is the number for fullness and completion, and 10 is the number for those things as well. And so 7 times 10, I think he's just saying this is a set period of time that these things are going to happen. And yeah, I think they've played out throughout church history, and there's still some things yet to come. I think Christ was the apex of it. He's the anointed one who's cut off, who brings an end to sin, who ends sacrifice and offerings because he was the final sacrifice, who makes a strong covenant with God's people. But then yet there is still a desolator to come, the man of lawlessness, Antichrist, who will be put an end. There'll be an end put to him, which is still in our future. So I think it's symbolic for a certain period of time. God's answering this prayer of Daniel. He is going to restore his people, and here's what it's going to look like. So,
wow, that's killer. Awesome.
Yeah.
What do you got, Tyler?
I'm just listening.
Yeah, I don't know what else you want me to say.
That's good.
I mean,
yeah. Daniel's an intimidating book to preach. I mean, any of those apocalyptic books are, but, in true fashion, you've just plowed right through it.
Yeah, I've tried to, again, focus on we're not going to get lost in the weeds. And I try to say, here's what it seems to be to me, but regardless of where you land on these things, here's what we know for sure. Because there is a message, a big idea in each chapter that regardless of how you exegete the details, here's what it means. And it's actually really encouraging for God's people. But I mean, it's been kind of humbling and kind of funny that really brilliant scholars, guys like Sidney Greidanus, will say, I never actually preached this when I was a pastor because I didn't feel like I could give it adequate study time. But now, afterwards, I'm going to write a commentary. Or he said that with Daniel 9, reading commentaries on Daniel 9, 24 through 27 is like entering a maze with all these different doors and dead ends and not really sure where you're to go. So have fun with that. Pretty much is what he's saying.
Wow. Yeah.
I guess Jerome in 400 AD just presented to his congregation all 9 views and just said, decide for yourself.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
there's a lot of different views on it, but
Okay, so what do you say to the church member? And I don't know if you've dealt with this at all, but like, what do you say to the church member who comes to you like in the midst of preaching this because it's on front of the mind, and they're like, "Well, here's exactly what this means for certain," and it kind of has become a hobby horse for them, or like something that, like a hill that they're willing to die on. Like, what's your response?
yeah. So, I mean, I guess it would depend on what they're talking about. Yeah, I don't know. I'd probably just say, that's one view, and I've heard that view, but I think there's other views that have a lot of compelling evidence too. There's really no view that doesn't have any problem passages or verses that are like, how do you explain that? And so I remember Gary Breshears used to say in seminary, like, your view should be the one that accounts for the most biblical evidence with the least amount of problems. And so, but that acknowledges that your view is still probably going to have some problems, even though it has a ton of biblical evidence. And so I think that's the case with eschatological views. But I think I've learned, even just like really sitting down and studying Daniel, like we have all sorts of views from like either what we grew up learning or like even books in pop culture, like Left Behind movies and those different things. But like, I don't think a lot of us have actually sat down and studied verse by verse these chunks of the Bible. Because when I've done that in Daniel, it becomes pretty obvious, like this isn't being revealed in order to like have it in one hand and the newspaper in the other and be like connecting all the dots. That's not the point. God's people are in exile. They're wondering if he's going to keep his promises. And he's saying, yes, I'm going to fulfill my promises. And so be encouraged. And even though you see all these evil rulers, whether it's Nebuchadnezzar or Cyrus or the Greeks or the Romans, regardless, I am the everlasting king. I'm on the throne. My plan is going to thwart them all. So don't be afraid. Like, that's the point. It's not, now you have to do a little bit of interpretation to even get to that point where it's like the Greeks and the Romans and those things. But some of it historically now from our vantage point is pretty clear, like Antiochus Epiphanes and those things. But yeah, so if people actually sit down and really study it and don't just rely on Kirk Cameron movies or
shots fired.
Yeah.
Okay. Doing that, huh?
Yeah, but I mean, I've heard some really interesting things about people saying, Elon Musk is the man of lawlessness or the little horn. And every generation has thought that they're living in the last days. And the reality is we've been living in the last days since Jesus ascended.
Yes.
But everyone thinks that they're the generation that he's going to return and all these things are going to take place. And I think if you're that confident, I don't think that's wise. And I think, yeah.
But you should pretty much live that way anyway, right? Without like freaking out about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should live as if he can come at any time because he can come at any time. But if you're certain that you're interpreting the signs and I mean, I think that goes against Jesus saying, as the Son in his human nature didn't even know the day or the hour, and just being humble. I think with all these complex theological issues, like being humble, like there's a lot of different views and guys and gals way smarter than me that hold different views. And so like your eschatological view is not a top tier die for issue. And so let's not make it that, like we can agree to disagree, but these are in-house debates. But some people, I mean, especially, and I have many people I love in this camp, but especially of the dispensational variety, they put it up there and kind of almost a divide force sometimes. If you don't believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, 70 weeks of Daniel with that gap week between 69 and 70 weeks, and, the Antichrist and all these things and geopolitical things happening, then you just don't understand the clear teaching of Scripture. There's a lot of that attitude in that, and I think that's one view, and it could be right, but it might not be the only view. So,
Could we do this real quick? Because I think that people would benefit from this. Could we quickly just succinctly go through, like, okay, when we say somebody is dispensational, we mean this. When we say somebody is amillennial, we mean this. Like what would be like the Wikipedia top paragraph version of each of those things? So like let's just start with the dispensational.
Yeah, so dispensational theology, I think one way to help to understand it is to contrast it with covenant theology, which is more popular kind of in the Reformed covenantal traditions and denominations. So if covenantal theology flattens out the Bible, meaning there's a lot of continuity from Old to New Covenant, Old to New Testament, then dispensational theology would be the opposite. They would have more discontinuity between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. There'd be a special place for Israel, not only in the Old Covenant, but in the future and in their eschatology. Israel's going to be restored, the temple rebuilt, the Antichrist is going to desolate that future temple, all those sorts of things. And so they would view Israel and the church as separate, as different. And yeah, it would be a choppier way to break up your Bible, more discontinuity, more walls, whereas covenant theology would flatten things out and say there's actually more similarities from Old and New Covenant. Now, in between that, from dispensational to covenant theology, there's all sorts of different places along the spectrum. There's progressive dispensationalism, which is more towards the middle. There's new covenantalism, which would be more towards the middle. But that would be another thing with dispensational would be that they interpret the Bible literally, not meaning that other people don't, but they would say a literal interpretation would mean the prophecies in the Old Testament to Israel need to be interpreted literally, and they're literally going to happen. So Israel's going to be in the land. There's going to be a new Jerusalem. All those things, the temple rebuilt, rather than other viewpoints would say, no, those things have been spiritually fulfilled in Christ, and they're not going to be literally fulfilled in the future. Now, there's a ton of other things you could say, but
yeah, I think a major way, Tyler, that it's broken down, and you mentioned amillennial, right? A major way it's broken down is by the view of the millennium, right? Mm-hmm. So toward the end of Revelation, it talks about 1,000 years, and the three major camps are premillennial, postmillennial, and amillennial. Amillennial and postmillennialism both agree on Christ is going to return after the millennium. Whereas amillennialism, and meaning like no millennial kingdom, kind of takes the 1,000 years very figuratively, and believes we're present. Amillennialists believe that we're presently living in the millennial kingdom, which is characterized simultaneously. And I'm reading this by an essay online by Alan Brady that we'll put in the show notes. So amillennialists believe we're presently living in the millennial kingdom, characterized by the simultaneous experiences of gospel victory and suffering for the gospel, right? So they take that the 1,000 years very figurative. Post-millennialism, which I've noticed in recent years, millennialism seems to be having kind of a comeback. It holds that Christ will return after the millennium, but different than amillennialism, it doesn't take the millennium to be like super metaphorical. It believes that like there's going to become 1,000-year reign where Christians are going to reign with Christ for 1,000 years, and that's going to occur, and then the end will come after that. And so, and then premillennialists, that's kind of what he's describing. With there's dispensational premillennialism and historic premillennialism, yeah. But those two, without splitting hairs on it all, it basically believes, kind of what you grew up with. Many of us did grow up with the dispensational type ideas. I mean, you mentioned Kirk Cameron, kind of the Left Behind series. Yeah, like the return, the rapture, so-called rapture is going to happen, and then the millennium is going to happen after that. And so what you tend to see is like, if I were to really stereotype these, premillennialists kind of think that like, either we're going to rapture and then things are going to get really bad and then the millennium comes later. Post-millennialism is kind of a lot more kind of present day, evangelistic, Great Commission.
And things are going to get better.
Things are going to get better, yeah. And like be politically involved, and there's going to be victory, on this earth in those ways, and it's going to get better and better, and then Christ is going to finish it all with the return. Whereas amillennial kind of marries those two of going, takes that metaphorically and as more of a symbol, has been talked about with apocalyptic literature, and that Christ is going to return, and that's going to be it in the end. And so, super truncated version there, but that's a pretty thorough essay by Alan Bandy. I think I said Alan Brady.
Okay,
Alan Bandy. We'll have that in the show notes.
The literal interpretation of Scripture is why. So, like with a dispensational, they believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ and a literal Jerusalem, New Jerusalem. And so, again, it's those sorts of rules that lead to those different kind of views. Okay, so you said a so-called rapture.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you clarify? Why did you categorize it that way?
Because the idea of the kind of premillennial dispensationalist idea that there's like going to be a rapture and then all this stuff is going to happen later that you read about in Revelation, I just don't think is a biblical view. So I looked at the two of you there, but so the rapture is a very, very recent thought in Christian thinking. Really just goes back, I think, like 100 years, 150 years.
Dispensational theology is I think the Darby Study Bible that really launched in the mid-1800s.
So now the idea of rapture, like I think the Latin word there means like meeting Christ in the air, right? And you do get that we will be caught up with him. I think that's where they get the idea from rapture. 1 Thessalonians 4, right? I think when I say rapture, I mean the sort of prototypical Left Behind series, like, we're gonna just like a bunch of Christians are just gonna disappear and boom, it's the rapture. I think there's a lot of people in American Christianity have kind of taken that as gospel, where biblically speaking, it's one of those I do not think that means what you think it means type of deal. So we are going to meet Christ in the air. There is going to be that, but is that when he returns in the end, or is that going to be what is 1 Thessalonians 4 really talking about there? The idea in Revelation, and I took a class from a dispensationalist one time on a postgraduate course at a seminary on Revelation, and I tried to nail him on like where do you get the idea of the rapture in Revelation, and it's just pretty weak in terms of the idea that, this right here is where the rapture occurs. And you're just like, what are you even saying? The text is not saying that. So, I think like,
well,
that's going to move some cheese for some people, but it is what it is.
Yeah, and there are a lot of other views that can be biblically defended. Another place people will go is like Matthew 24, Olivet Discourse, where Jesus says 2 will be in the field, 1 left, and that sort of thing. But I think we have to actually revisit that text and be like, what is Jesus talking about here? I think in part of that text, he is talking about the second coming. I also think it's pretty clear that he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And I mean, that whole conversation starts with, he tells them these stones on the temple are not going to be standing. And they're like, tell us when these things will be. And then he describes what's going to happen. I think a lot of that was already fulfilled in 70 AD. There are things with his second coming that have not yet been fulfilled. And so that kind of view would be similar to what's called a partial preterist view. Preter, I think in Latin, just means past. Whereas a dispensational view would be a futurist view, that these things are still yet to happen in the future. But there's a lot to consider, like even with that 1 Thessalonians 4 thing. I read a book by a guy who was saying that culturally what that actually would mean, it would be similar to like when a king was coming to a city or a town, people would go out to meet the king and then come back with him in his processional or whatever. And that could have been a similar thing, like as Christ returns. It's not that we go away then during the tribulation, but it's his coming. I remember really, when I was really wrestling with this many years ago, reading some of the main passages and being like, it just doesn't seem like there's these two comings of Christ, where there's this kind of secret one where he takes his people in the rapture, and then this second really public one. It seems like when Christ is going to return, it's going to be very public, very obvious, very final. And so, I think there's a lot of problems with the pre-trib rapture, premillennial view. But
one thing I was taught growing up was looking at Matthew 24, and it was just like the 2 men in the field, and then the Larry Norman song, I Wish We'd All Been Ready, kind of like, definitely drove that point home. But if you look at verse 39, it's like the judgment that's coming. Like
Uh-huh.
they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be with the coming of the Son of Man.
Yeah.
It's almost like the one who's taken away, like just following that, like
Yes.
that train of thought. The one who's taken away is the one who's being judged.
Yes,
Yeah.
not being
the,
raptured.
not the one being. Yeah. So that when I read that, it was like, whoa.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah,
when he
take that,
says
Tim
when-
LaHaye.
And when you see the desolation, flee to the mountains, like Christians were to do that when Titus and the armies literally surrounded Jerusalem and conquered it and destroyed it. And he says this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Growing up, we always had to figure out how to like explain that away. Well, he doesn't actually mean that this generation.
Yeah.
And I think it makes most sense if he does. So
Yeah. We've just very, very lightly skimmed the surface of all this stuff, and maybe this will present more questions.
I was going to say, we didn't even respond to a question this one, but we definitely raised some new ones.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've sent Cody a couple of things. There's the Alan Bandy short essay on the Millennium. Another one is called An Evening of Eschatology, and it's a YouTube clip that has John Piper, Doug Wilson, and another guy. Doug Wilson's kind of a post-millennial guy.
Sam Storms.
Sam Storms, I think,
And
is the
Jim
amillennial
Hamilton.
view, and then Piper talks about maybe historic premillennialism, or dispensationalism. So it's really good. When I was in that course in seminary, they had us watch that as one of our assignments, and it's like, if you're into this stuff, that's definitely an hour-long YouTube video that you want to check out. So
Yeah. So if you want to pose a question or let us know your opinion or tell us why we're wrong, feel free to hit us up, podcast@toBeTheChurch.com, on social media @toBeTheChurch, or right there in the YouTube comments just underneath this video. Have a great week.